Is the DOGE program targeted at these bureaucrats?
The USAID overthrew 8 governments.
It was funded.
Absolutely. So is Antifa.
So
George Soros, USAID.
USAID funded Antifa.
That's right. When your goal is to collapse the system, you're going to collapse the system. When you collapse the system, you don't know how that dust is going to settle.
But you think that Biden was deliberately trying to collapse the system?
I do. What we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years, both in Europe as well as the United States and North America, is mass migration, not immigration. Why that's significant is because what that's allowed these various groups to do is come in and basically set up shop in another country, but bring their own culture and never have to assimilate. The Pakistani rape gangs in England are exactly what I'm talking about.
There's some fantastic footage of you face-to-face with Merrick Garland.
The consequences of the Biden and Mayorkas open border policies. That's Congress's fault. I had Mayorkas in front of me. I told him what a corrupt person I thought that he was, to his face. We know you've lied. You know you've lied. But more importantly, the American public knows that you lied. I said all along, Joe Biden and Mayorkas are the 2 largest human traffickers in U.S. history, and they are.
Cool. I want to ask if you've changed position on what happened in the 2020 election.
Oh, I think it was rigged, and I'll tell you why.
Before we get into the interview with Congresswoman Harriet Hageman, I ask if you want to support this show. All you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Congresswoman Hageman exploring the issues you want to hear about and that the mainstream media won't touch. Also, head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, which is our Substack for exclusive videos, interviews, and content, and ad-free listening and watching. But without further ado, here she is, Congresswoman Harriet Hageman. Congresswoman Harriet Hageman, welcome to London. Thank you for speaking with me here at the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference hosted by Jordan Peterson.
I am honored to be here.
The honor is absolutely mine. I was looking into this, looking into your work, and frankly, so much of what you do is exciting, and I hope we can talk about stuff like the Censorship Accountability Act you brought in. We've just had Michael Schellenberger here discussing the censorship industrial complex, and you have been involved in the MAGA movement for a couple of years now. Mm-hmm. I kind of wanted to get to your story, your interaction with Liz Cheney. You're obviously Congresswoman for Wyoming, and you ousted the kind of totem of the old rhino Republican right, a Cheney. Cheney herself reared her head again before the election, saying she backed Kamala Harris, if you could believe it. I want to understand all of that, your insight, your personal journey, and also this, how to make sense of the Cheneys and what this tells us about America.
So I am a native of Wyoming. I grew up there. My great-grandfather came to Wyoming from Texas in 1879 on a cattle trail. Huh. And he ended up having a ranch in Wyoming. That ranch is still in the family. It belongs to some cousin of ours, but I grew up on a ranch about 100 miles north of Cheyenne. Most of my family is still in agriculture. I have a very large family, went to a very small school. I actually went to college on a livestock judging scholarship, and then I went to the University of Wyoming where I received both my bachelor's and my law degree. Huh. My connection with Wyoming is very deep. It's very strong. As I said, a large family, 60 some of us. The vast majority are still in Wyoming. So I have a dog in this hunt when it comes to protecting Wyoming and protecting our culture and our future and our legacy industries. And I think that's one of the things that really set me apart from Liz Cheney.
Okay. So what was Liz Cheney doing that kind of irked you into taking her on?
Well, exactly what was the front-facing persona of Liz Cheney starting in the November of 2020 and then accelerating in 2021. So Liz Cheney really didn't live in Wyoming. And she came there. She was a carpetbagger. She ran for the Senate, the U.S. Senate first in 2013, but realized she could not beat Mike Enzi, so dropped out of that race, and then came back in 2016 to run for the House of Representatives. I believe that there were 8 or 9 people who ran in the primary that year, and as a result, they all split the anti-Cheney vote, and she walked in winning the primary with 44% of the vote, which was really quite a good showing. Mm-hmm. I supported Liz Cheney at that time. I thought that she would be a good voice for Wyoming. I believed her when she talked about her family living there and how she felt about Wyoming and energy. But what really happened is that she immediately morphed into the swamp creature that we now, maybe not as bad, because there was a bit of a governor on her, I guess, because she wanted to continue to run for office from Wyoming. But she really didn't pay a lot of attention to Wyoming after that. So I didn't have much to do with her after the 2016 election when she was elected.
If I may, I think of Cheney, I think of her father, Dick Cheney. He is the face of the neoconservatives and everything really that the MAGA movement is against. So it's quite strange actually to hear you say that you supported her then, because seeing as I see you as sort of part of the MAGA anti-neocon movement.
That was not really on the ascendancy at that point. Keep that in mind.
In 2020?
In 2016.
2016.
So it wasn't 2020 that I supported her. It was 2016.
Oh, okay.
So at that time, she was saying all the right things, that she supported Donald Trump and he was the president. She would vote aligned with him. She was saying all the right things. In fact, she was part of the Tea Party movement in the state of Wyoming. So she was trying to kind of hide that neoconservative mantle under the bed. And I think a lot of us bought it. But again, by 2018, by 2020, we were tolerating her as our representative because we didn't see people who had the ability to run against her. But I don't think that she was necessarily representing Wyoming well. An example is I'm on the Natural Resource Committee because we're one of the largest energy producers in the nation. We have a very strong ag industry, livestock production, crop production, those sorts of things. She was on Homeland, she was on the Homeland Security side of things. She was on Armed Services Committee. She was not on the committees that helped Wyoming. She was on the committees that helped Virginia. And so as she evolved as a representative for Wyoming, she was very much moving away from Wyoming. And that's how we learn more about Liz Cheney as she represented
When
us.
you say Virginia, you mean that's where she was living? And okay.
So she had a second home in Wyoming, but she and her family lived in Virginia.
I see. So
she lied about that. She made people believe she was living in Wyoming, like having a wall at her house appear to be a log cabin type of structure so that when she did video and things, but she was not living in Wyoming.
And so at some point you were like, I'm gonna run against.
So in 2020, in November after the election, if you remember, she was one of the very first national figures to come out and demand that Donald Trump concede the election. And she received a lot of blowback. So she was calling people to try to shore up support. And I was one of them that she called. And she said, Donald Trump needs to concede. Joe Biden is the legitimate president. And I said, Liz, I don't know that. I said, I haven't figured out yet what happened. This was within 2 weeks of that November election. And I didn't know about the Zuckerberg money. There were a lot of things we didn't even know about at that time. But I said, we have the right to get to the bottom of what may have happened in this election. I just don't know what the answer is. And she threatened to have me disbarred. Her response was, Harriet, you are a member of the bar. You are required to be honest about these things. And when you lie or when you start professing things that are not true, you could be disbarred. And I just laughed at her and I said, oh, Liz, that isn't the way that this works. That was the last time I ever spoke with her. But she just strayed so far from where Wyoming was and what we wanted. And under a representative form of government, she can have her own philosophy. She can have her own beliefs, but we don't have to elect her to represent us.
And so then at what point do you make the decision you want to go into the dangerous world of politics?
So there were
perilous world.
There were several people who had identified that they were going to be running against her, and I just didn't feel like that they had the background of Wyoming, that they had the knowledge of Wyoming, that they had the skill set that I had to push forward with the issues that we needed to do. And I made the decision starting in the spring of 2021 and during the summer of 2021 that I was going to perhaps seek this seat. And I went and met with Donald Trump, and he later said that he would endorse me, and that's when I stepped into the race.
Okay, I see. Now, it's I want to ask about if you've changed position on what happened in the 2020 election.
Oh, I think it was rigged.
You think it was rigged?
Yeah, I know more now than I did then. All you have to do is in February of 2021, there was a Time magazine article that was published, and it was about Mark Zuckerberg investing $500 million in a Get Out the Democrat Vote campaign. And they focused on the swing states, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and they focused. And what they did is they basically did what I would refer to as agency capture. And they went in and they captured the county clerks and the secretaries of states in these states. And they basically said, we have a get out the vote campaign program. And if you will implement it exactly the way that we say that you must implement it, we will give you massive amounts of money to run your elections.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do not run it the way that we say, then we can claw all that money back. Well, think about it. If you're a small county in Wisconsin and you get $300,000 from Mark Zuckerberg's foundation to make sure that there are drop boxes in your Democrat-heavy areas, that there are that you've got an RV going around and hauling people into the polling places to vote. When you do that, if you do not carry out, you take that money, you sign that contract, and you do not do exactly what that foundation said, you were going to have to use public money to pay it back. You most likely would have ended up in prison. I mean, that's just one example of the way that the election was rigged. The Mark Zuckerberg money was huge. $500 million concentrated in Democrat counties for the purpose of getting out the Democrat vote.
How do you know it was to get the Democrat vote out? Because how does it exactly what are the mechanics of that, of how it functioned?
You just have to read the article.
Okay.
And what the article does is it lays it out, and the title is something along the lines of how a secret group of people were able to save the 2020 election, meaning how were they able to get Joe Biden elected.
Right.
There was that issue. There were the issues associated with the drop boxes. There were the issues associated with what was going on in the polling places. Something else people don't know is that started in the mid-1980s, there was a judge, a federal district court judge in New Jersey, who entered a consent decree that Republicans could not be poll watchers. So from mid-80s until 2020, Republicans were not allowed to be poll watchers on these national elections. And what happened was that judge eventually died, and the Democrats, the DNC, they had to go get that injunction renewed every 5 or 8 years, something along those lines. And when that judge died, he was replaced by an Obama judge. And they went back to that judge and they said, we want this consent decree in place, making it so Republicans cannot be poll watchers and cannot be a part of this process. And he said, what in the heck are you talking about? This is absolutely so unconstitutional. And he refused to renew that consent decree. He refused to renew that injunction. So 2020 was one of the first years that we had professional Republican poll watchers in these elections to see what was going on in Atlanta, in Detroit, in Milwaukee, in Philadelphia. It was the first time we were able to really see what was going on in these polling places. And what that tells me is that probably a lot of these shenanigans had been going on for a long, long time, but there were no Republicans there to report on it.
Do you think it's comparable at all to Elon Musk's throughout the 2024 election? I know he was specifically targeting individuals. He would reward them with let's say $1 million. Was it $1 million if you go out and vote? And he had these kind of lotteries.
A lottery.
Is that comparable, do you think, or is that a different sort of?
I think it's entirely different in terms of the money that Mark Zuckerberg was spending was money that you should never have your elections controlled by a private individual. Your elections must be run by elected officials so that they are accountable to the people. You cannot have agency capture. You cannot have a circumstance where the Pennsylvania law or the Wisconsin law says one thing and these counties are going in and doing something entirely different because they're paid private funds to do something.
The difference is it's the system rather than individuals.
That's exactly right.
And with Trump now winning, do you think that what happened in that rigging is it, or those who think, I'm totally honest, I'm not particularly convinced either way. I definitely think there was a rigging of sorts in terms of how the Hunter Biden and laptop story was censored.
That's another example.
I've looked deeply into that. I'm completely convinced of that. And I think there was lots of censorship going on. And in my mind, I consider that a version of rigging. I haven't gone so deep.
That's why I don't say stealing. I say rigging. And that's an important word and an important distinction you just made. Covering up the Hunter Biden laptop had an enormous impact on that election because had people known how corrupt the Biden the Biden family was, I think that you would have had a different outcome. Now, keep in mind, if there were millions of votes between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in 2020, it would be more difficult for me to make that argument. But when I believe in Arizona, the difference was 11,000 people. So a switch of 5,500 votes would have had a different outcome in Arizona. Same thing in Wisconsin and Michigan. When you suppress a story of that magnitude that goes to the heart of the person that you are electing, I think it was very, very important. It was very significant. So again, I don't know that we need to keep revisiting 2020, because one of the things that the RNC and the Republicans did a better job of in 2024 is making sure that they couldn't rig it. So what did they do? They were fighting the lawsuits before the elections were held. And that was an argument that I've been making for years, is you're going to be hard-pressed to get a judge to overthrow an election, even if you come in and you prove fraud, because you have to prove that the outcome of the election would have been different, which is nigh on an impossibility. So you have to win the battle before the ballots are cast if you're going to win. So the Republican Party this time was much more effective at playing in the courtrooms to make sure that they were not able to continue to cheat. So they won very important lawsuits in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania. They won important lawsuits to make it much more difficult to cheat. And frankly, all of us should be very proud of that and very happy about that. We want to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. And that was really what happened in the 2024 election. And I think that's part of why you saw the outcome you did.
So do you think that you just suggested or said explicitly that there's no point in revisiting what happened with the quote unquote rigging, whether we agree or not? Is that to say that there's not worth the time? Do you not think that if it was indeed rigged, do you not want justice?
I do want justice. And what I meant by that is that I think it's incredibly important that we expose what happened in 2020, which is in part what you and I are talking about right now. But what I was saying is that I believe that we are working hard to fix those things. I want people to have confidence in our elections, and I want people to understand, and your listeners to understand, that while we had those challenges in 2020, and people should be held to account for that, it's incredibly important to understand that we also did move beyond it. So when I was elected, because people were so concerned about election integrity, one of the first things I did as a new Congresswoman is I had been collecting articles, 2-3 inch high of articles of what went wrong and how 2020 was rigged. And then other issues of how things were being affected with our elections. And I went to the RNC. I set up a meeting, spent substantial amount of time, and went through every one of those. What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? How are you looking at this? How many attorneys do you have in place? And I then followed up over the next 2 years of my tenure as a freshman Congresswoman. So I met with them probably a total of 4 times, going through saying, okay, what are you doing in this lawsuit? What are you doing in that one? And the only reason I did that is not that I'm an election integrity attorney. I'm not an elections attorney, but it is important to my constituency, and I wanted them to make sure that they understood that I took this incredibly seriously and that the RNC would take it incredibly seriously.
You mentioned Biden, also the criminality of Biden. He has pardoned his family, and he's pardoned Fauci. He's pardoned 8,064 individuals. A lot of people are unhappy about that. Is this something? Do you think, a grave injustice? Is it something there can't be anything done about it? So move on. And I also ask the context of, there are characters, let's say like Steve Bannon, who was also pardoned at the end of Trump's first term, but then lawfare came after him in the period after for things. For example, he was only going to be pardoned at the federal level, but they came after him at the states level. Only 2 weeks ago, he was in New York state. Do we look at Fauci and these other pardons of the Biden family as kind of over, like move on for it, not a good use of time?
So I think that what you see with the apex level of corruption with the Biden administration is a recognition of what our forefathers said about our Constitution and our form of government, which that it is only the form of government that we have is only suitable for a just and moral and Christian people. And so our Constitution and our laws are not set up to address the level of corruption that we saw in the Biden administration. And I don't just mean corruption from the standpoint of, taking $1 million from Burisma and $5 million from the Chinese government, although those are all bad. What I mean is that when you put someone who is morally corrupt in the position of the presidency of the United States, they can do a lot of damage because of the form of government we set up. Our forefathers set up a form of government that was based upon the aspirations and the intellect and the integrity of the people to be elected. So when you have someone like Biden, who has no North Star, who has been corrupt for 50 years, whose entire family has made millions off the graft, whose entire, not only his family, but anyone in his circle has benefited from whatever corruption could benefit them, and you put that person at the top position in the United States of America, sometimes it's going to be hard to hold them accountable. So our forefathers never expected that you would have someone come in and do 9,000 pardons, because that's absurd. Because no moral person would do that. They didn't necessarily have a way of addressing some of the other things that he did, because they didn't think people would do it. So when you say, is anybody going to be held accountable? They were held accountable on November 5th, 2024. Right. We won. And that's really what our form of government does. So you ask about Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney was held accountable in August of 2022 when I kicked the dog out of her in the election. Right? She was held accountable. She may not go to jail, and she may not, she may not get the retribution that some people would like to see. But our form of government kicks out the bad, and we hopefully replace it with the good or the better. And so right now, we went through Joe Biden. We went through 4 years of hell. The world suffered because of Joe Biden. A weak America makes for a very dangerous world. Ukraine has suffered because of Joe Biden. The Middle East has suffered because of Joe Biden. But because he was so bad, and because of what we had to go through, we now have a much brighter future. And sometimes when you're dealing with government and you're dealing with culture and you're dealing with looking at your long-term horizon and agenda, you're going to have some low points. And Biden's were a low point for us. They were bad, and they were bad for America, and they were bad for the world. But in their place, we have someone like J.D. Vance coming to Europe and saying, I look around and I say, what happened to the countries that won World War II? And people are kind of, they're pulling their hair out and their heads are exploding and they're rending their clothing and they're crying and doing all this silly stuff in response. But he was asking a very legitimate question, which is, we fought for freedom in World War II. We fought for liberty. We fought against tyranny. We fought against fascism. We fought against the level of depravity that we saw during World War II. We all did. So much of England, London was destroyed fighting that battle. And then we're going to say, but you can't criticize your neighbor? I mean, what the heck? Well, how'd we get there?
Perhaps one thing I think Americans might make about Europe and Britain is that we don't have a tradition of free speech in the same way that you do in America. In fact, that's an American value, not necessarily a Western value.
But it's based upon English values.
It's based upon a set of tracts and acts. You think of John Stuart Mill, John Milton, John Locke, who were all arguing for free speech precisely because they didn't have free speech.
Right.
So there's a long tradition of arguing for free speech, and we have that tradition because we never really had free speech. And the Europeans have a tendency to be even more totalitarian than us. I think that might be a sort of cultural mistake. But so you mentioned just on accountability, and you're saying that the election was how that they were held accountable, and yet you have set up the Censorship Accountability Act. So it's not entirely true to say that you don't want some justice. Can you tell me about the Censorship Accountability Act? I know this was 2023, so
no, I just refiled it. It was the first
you refiled.
Bill, it was the first bill that I refiled. So I'm a constitutional attorney. I practiced law for 34 years, primarily litigation, before I came to Congress. And we have what's called 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, and that is a statute that came into effect after the Civil War because states were continuing to attempt to deprive freed slaves of their civil liberties. And so the bills or that law says that any person who, under color of state law, violates the constitutional rights of an individual can be held accountable in law, in equity, and they have to pay their attorney's fees. We don't have a counterpart for the federal side. So what we have seen over the last 4 or 6 years especially is this incredible effort at the industrial censorship complex, as you were saying earlier. And during COVID, it was just absolutely off the charts in terms of preventing people from exercising their religion. So the First Amendment has 5 pillars: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom to petition your government for redress, and freedom to peaceably assemble. Those are the 5 pillars of the First Amendment. What my bill says is that any person who, under color of federal law, violates any of those 5 pillars under the First Amendment can be held liable at law, in equity, meaning an injunction, and they have to pay attorney's fees. An example, as we know, right after the terrible storm that hit North Carolina and Florida, we know that FEMA was not going to the doors of people who had Trump signs in their yard. Okay?
Oh.
They were saying we're not. They had a written policy that they were not to go to the doors of people who had Trump signs in their yard. That is a classic example of viewpoint discrimination that is prohibited by the First Amendment. It is prohibited by the First Amendment, but there's no remedy. Under my bill, those people would be able to sue the FEMA employees that violated their First Amendment rights. They could seek damages, an injunction, and attorney's fees.
But not retrospectively, right? So it would just be anything that happens going forward. So you recognize the problem. Okay. So there won't, for all of this type of things, it is what it is. We have to kind of get over it. But we must remember, of course.
We have to remember it. And the point that I kept making during COVID is I was screaming at the top of my lungs and refusing to wear a mask and refusing shots and all of these various things. I filed the very first lawsuit in the United States against vaccine mandates. I sued Michigan State University because they refused to acknowledge natural immunity. But while
Did you win?
No, because it was the first lawsuit and judges are scared. But we won the next ones. We won the lawsuit for all contractors, all federal contractors, and we won the lawsuit for all federal employees that they did not have to have the vaccines. That the vaccine mandates under Biden were illegal. But you do these things because incrementally you have to win them. But the point that I made during all of this is people would say, but it's an emergency. And I'd say, that's the only time the Constitution is the most important. When I'm just walking down the street minding my own business, that's not when it matters. It matters when there's a crisis. Our civil liberties and the protection of our civil liberties matter when there's a crisis, not when things are easy. And that's why it is so important to have the renaissance that we're seeing here at ARC, the renaissance that we're seeing with the election of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, the renaissance that we're seeing with the various bills such as the First Amendment Accountability Act. We are attempting to make it clear that our civil liberties, our rights really do come from God. Government cannot constrain them. That is the light that we want the message that we want the world to understand. Freedom and liberty matter. Government is there only to protect the homeland, provide the national security, and protect our civil liberties.
What's your analysis on how America came to this place? Your analysis on how freedom, and freedom is such what I think of America if we could whittle it down to one word, it would be freedom. And then I've seen what's happened over the last 4 years, and it's been actively fighting against freedom, whether it was COVID and all these other things. What's your analysis on that's happened that America got to this place? And I think part of the answer might help us understand how Trump and the MAGA movement came out.
So I'm going to go back 110 years, and that's Woodrow Wilson. And he was the first president, one of the worst presidents in our history, comparable to Joe Biden in terms of his destructive philosophy. But he felt that it was the educated class, the elite class, the betters among us who should be making the decisions. So that was kind of the beginning of the administrative state, put on steroids during FDR. And then with Bill Clinton in 1994, when the Republicans took over the House for the first time in like 40 years, here he was sitting there not being able to get his agenda through. And so in the last 30 years, 30 to 40 years, you've seen an absolute explosion in the administrative state. The impact is a hidden tax of about $2.1 trillion a year, but it's that administrative state that is constraining us without any accountability. And I'll give you just a couple of examples.
Please.
So I come from, as I said, a ranching community. I grew up on a ranch. The USDA for several years has been trying to force our cattle and bison producers to use what are called RFID or EID ear tags, electronic identification ear tags. They want to chip them all. And I've been fighting against this, and they say it's for disease traceability. If there's a brucellosis outbreak or hoof and mouth disease, we've got to know that immediately so we can isolate that animal, and et cetera. We have the very best disease traceability program anywhere in the world in the United States. It's worked beautifully for hundreds of years. It's extremely effective. We're able to isolate animals immediately if there's an issue, despite the fact, and in addition to which we have the healthiest herds of anywhere in the world. So you look at all of that, and so you think, okay, what is this really about? And then you start looking at the countries that have implemented this. Ireland implemented it in early 2022. By August of 23, they were issuing an order that they had to slaughter 41,000 head of cattle, not because of a disease outbreak, but because of global warming. In the Netherlands, Denmark, they adopted an EID mandate, and last year they imposed a $100 a head tax on every single head of cattle in the country, not because of a disease outbreak, because of global warming. So what you start seeing is how they use this information. This is a $1.2 to $1.9 billion tax on the cattle industry if it's actually implemented 100%, which is where they want to go. That isn't Congress who passed that law. That is an administrative agency that has constrained the rights of the ranchers to do what they think is in the best interest of their business and their herds. Ranchers don't want disease outbreaks. It could devastate them. It could destroy them. We do a very, very, very good job of maintaining and protecting our healthy herds. We don't need the USDA to get involved in doing that. But you can multiply that by millions. The number of regulations, the number of regulations are over 3,000 major regulations a year. We're passing 150 laws. A major regulation is one that has an economic impact of over $100 million. So we've got
3,000 regulations are being passed a year, each one of which have an impact of $100 million.
Over
$100 million.
Over 100
And none of them are passed by elected representatives. They're all passed by
unelected bureaucrats.
By bureaucrats, by the bureaucracy.
By the bureaucracy. So let's look at the 2009 endangerment finding that came out of the EPA. The endangerment finding is where they concluded that CO2, methane, NOx, and 3 other gases are pollutants, all of which exist in the natural environment. They cannot, by definition, be determined to be pollutants. Yet the EPA defined them as pollutants. That is the basis for all of the global warming, all of the climate change stuff that we have been dealing with, the mandate on EV vehicles, the mandate that's shutting down our coal-fired power plants. England has the highest electricity rates of any country in the world.
Yes, 4 or 5x what you've got in the States.
And it's because of the nonsense of these bureaucrats adopting these regulations without any input from the citizenry whatsoever. So the endangerment finding I refer to as the head of the snake. But that is where they got the power to then demand that we get rid of all coal-fired power plants, that we have to go to wind and solar, which is unreliable and unaffordable, that we don't have a supply chain, that we have to give up eating beef. It is the way that the bureaucracy, that the elite class, that the overeducated have permeated every aspect of our government and taken away our civil rights, every regulation at a time.
So is the DOGE program targeted at these bureaucrats?
Yes.
And so what can you expect?
Well, let's look at the Department of Education. The Federal Department of Education has a budget of about $280 billion a year. Less than 25% goes to educating our students. So where does the other $220 billion go? It goes to a bureaucracy. It goes to a consultant. And that consultant then donates money back to the Democrats. And then it goes to a different consultant. And then it goes to an NGO. And then it goes to, it is money laundering and money churning at its absolute best. And you can look at almost every single agency and you will find it. So the brilliance of DOGE isn't that he's going in and cutting spending. He doesn't have the authority authority to do that. We're the ones that have the authority to do that. What I want him to do is come up with a report, go through agency by agency by agency, identify every single program that we should not be funding, put a number attached to it. We slap a preamble on the front of that report, and we say that every single agency is having their budget cut by X amount as shown in the attached report, and none of those programs can go forward from here on out.
And are your colleagues generally on board with DOGE? Is this supported across the party?
I believe that they are. It sure seems like it. But you look at USAID, 50, $60 billion. That's a lot of money. Some people will say it's not that much money.
It's very small in terms of the annual spend of the government.
But what we were exporting was so toxic.
Right.
So it isn't
and pointless.
just...
Well, not even pointless. Worse than pointless because it's toxic.
Worse than pointless. They overthrew 8 governments. The USAID overthrew 8 governments. What in the world? Why would we have an unelected bureaucracy, an unaccountable bureaucracy run by Samantha Power, for goodness sakes, actually infiltrating and messing with governments around the world? Now, look, I don't necessarily agree with the leadership in Colombia or Guatemala or Nicaragua. Obviously, I have a very different political philosophy. But the people in those countries, they care about their families. They care about having food on the table. They care about some of the very core things that we believe in as well. And we are inundating them with absolutely toxic ideas.
It's very interesting because for the entirety of my life, I always hear it from left-wingers and socialists and progressives. Well, you don't know what the Americans have been doing and conniving and Venezuela and trying to change regimes across the world. This was a left-wing position. And now that the revolution seems to be wearing a little red hat, not a Maoist hat, I note, a Trumpian MAGA hat, they are not happy about it. And a lot of people that you'd think would be generally supportive, and some of them have been open and honest about it, like Jon Favreau, the Obama former speechwriter, who's got now a big podcast, said, we should have done this, I think, or at least it was said on his podcast. And so what do you make of that? Why is there this odd flip now that a lot of the left, who probably would have supported this if this was a Democrat position, are turning against you?
The reason that they didn't support it and the reason they didn't do it is, again, it's one of the ways in which massive amounts of federal money have been laundered through organizations and back into the DNC coffers.
And they know about it.
I'll be very...
You think they know about it?
I absolutely know for a fact that they know about it. When you look at the NGOs that we have been funding to support the invasion on our southern and northern borders, when you look at, I'll name them, Catholic Charities, you look at these various organizations, Catholic Charities, $1.2 billion we have paid in the last 4 years, $1.2 billion to Catholic Charities to bring people into our country illegally. Okay? That portions of that money is going right back to the DNC. The money that we are laundering through these agencies, the money that we're laundering through these NGOs, the money that we're laundering through these various organizations throughout the world is not only again funding things that are toxic to the very culture that we're supposed to be helping, but that money is finding its way back into people who want to continue the gravy train. Now, I'll talk about Ukraine, and there's a difference. I am not a globalist, but I'm also not an isolationist. I'm someone that I believe that every single entanglement we may engage in, we have to make sure that it is in the best interest of the United States to be involved. And I think that France should think the same way, and England should think the same way, and Australia should think the same way. You ought to be focusing on the best interest of your own people before you think outside of those boundaries. And Ukraine, one of my big issues has been that they won't ever tell us what the end goal is, which I don't know how you go into a military operation without knowing what your ultimate goal is. But the other thing they won't do is they won't provide an accounting. The United States of America has given Ukraine over $200 billion. $200 billion. A lot of it is to protect their own border, while ours is wide open. We are paying for their schools. We're paying for garbage collection. We're giving raises to their parliament. We can't get an accounting. We cannot get accounting of where that money is going. You know what they recently announced? They don't know where it went.
Yeah, Zelensky said they only got 80 billion.
Yeah, he says, we don't know where the money went. Well, for goodness sakes, somebody ought to know where it went.
Mm.
And that's one of the problems that we've had, and it's why DOGE is so incredibly important. He's not the one who will be making the cutting, but he is giving us the information, and I still think people are looking at this the wrong way. I look at DOGE as a form of zero-based budgeting, and the idea of zero-based budgeting is that you go into every single agency and every single program that the government funds, and you say, okay, you have been spending $16 million on education. That has funded 27 teachers, 36 schools. You have educated 643 students, whatever the numbers are. And then you figure out if you're getting your value and whether that number ought to go up or go down. That's really all DOGE is doing, is they are identifying the line items, budget items for all of these agencies, and then they're saying to Congress, you decide if you want to fund that or not.
Mm.
And what we're going to find is the vast majority of what these agencies are spending money on, we don't want to fund.
If I can just go back to Ukraine, Russia, because as we speak, there's talks of negotiations between the Americans and the Russians being held in Saudi Arabia, I believe. Zelensky and the Ukrainians have not been invited to the table, although perhaps it's wrong for me to use the term "to the table" because maybe this is a preliminary meeting before further negotiation. But certainly the press is putting it as these are the negotiations for peace. I'm not sure I'm fully convinced by what you said earlier that Ukraine haven't said what they want. I think they want their sovereignty. I think they want to protect their territory and reclaim it from the Russians and protect it for their own futures.
And that's where we might have a bit of a disagreement, because I don't know what it is that they believe that they're going to reclaim. I believe that the Donbass and Crimea have been lost for a long, long time, and I believe that Ukraine believes that. And if you'll remember, within about 6 months after this war started, Zelensky came out and said, we need to come to the table and we need to have a ceasefire. Mm-hmm. We need to talk about the ceasefire. We need to talk about settling this. This cannot go on. Mm-hmm. And who was the first government that came out and said, we're not talking ceasefire? Joe Biden. Now,
I believe our government was also part of that conversation.
And so I'm sitting
Boris
here
Johnson.
thinking, you got the parties to the combat, and they're wanting to sit down and talk about a ceasefire, and you've got third parties saying no. And that's when you start seeing that there was a different agenda for many countries around the world. It wasn't necessarily the protection of the Ukraine, but it was perhaps other geopolitical opportunities that they were looking at, and a ceasefire would not have enabled them to accomplish them.
From a pragmatic position, am I right in understanding that your position is a pragmatic one in that you don't believe that Donbass or Crimea are winnable because of where each side are currently at, and so then it's a question about funding a war that you don't think is winnable? Is that kind of where you stand?
That's part of it, but the average age of the Ukrainian soldier now is over 40 years old. Meaning we've lost.
So they've killed. There's so many men have been killed on both sides.
Just wiped out.
Yeah.
So when they say that the negotiations are happening between Russia and the United States and that Ukraine is kind of being shoved to the side, I would liken this to any kind of a settlement negotiation that I went into as an attorney attempting to resolve a lawsuit. You have your mediator, and that mediator goes into one room with one party.
Yeah.
And then he comes out and he goes into the other room with the other party. And then you come back and forth, and to the extent you need both parties in the room to discuss specific facts, you do that. But when you're mediating, especially at the very beginning, when you're mediating and you're attempting to understand either side, if you're going to develop the kind of trust that you need with both of those parties are going to have to be very, very honest.
Yeah. So do you feel that same way about Israel and Hamas?
I think that Hamas needs to be wiped off the face of the earth.
So no,
because that is a different agenda. Hamas only has one goal, and that is to wipe out Israel. I don't believe that about Russia and Ukraine. Hamas has demonstrated what they're willing to do. And what we've got is we have that they are a satellite office of Iran. Their purpose, their money, their entire existence from the time that they are born until they do the terrible things that they did on October 7th is to wipe out their neighbor. And when you look at what has happened in the Middle East over the years, when you look at what we have the empowerment that we have given to Iran by lifting the sanctions that we did, they've raised over $110 billion on oil and gas sales to fund Hamas, the Houthis, and Hezbollah. The absolute heartache that they have created in the Middle East, not only among the Israelis, but among the Palestinians, among the Jordanians, among the Libyans. You can go on and on and on. The destruction that they have caused, because their entire ideology is destructive. It's based on death.
Well, last week, President Trump said if all the hostages weren't returned by Saturday at midday, there would be, I thought, sort of the exact quote, all hell to pay. Hostages haven't been returned.
No, but what had happened is they said they weren't going to release the ones that were required to be released on Saturday. They pulled back. Hamas pulled back. I think it was Monday or Tuesday. And they said, we think that Israel has not kept its end of the bargain. We're not going to return the 3 hostages that were due to be released on Saturday. The moment Donald Trump said that, they said, all right, we're back on track. And they released the 3 hostages. So whether he should have said it the way that he did or whether that was what he needed to do for the impetus, we did get the 3 hostages that were scheduled to be released, which I think that if he had not said that, they would not have released those 3 hostages.
If I may circle back one bit that I'm keen to talk about, because there's some fantastic footage of you going off about the Obamas and going off about Gavin Newsom, but also you were face-to-face with Merrick Garland, which is somewhat relevant because he was head of the Jan 6th committee. And if we go back to the beginning of this conversation, talking about the 2020 election and whether or not it was rigged, and your argument that it was rigged. So I'm not sure exactly your involvement with the Jan 6th committee, and you've been challenging it, but Trump pardoned all of these people. Now, do you think, and J.D. Vance actually had an interesting position where he's like, for those who were committed violence, there should be real justice and law there. Do you think that was the right thing for Trump to do, to pardon all of the people involved in Jan 6th?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you why. One of the most important aspects of our Constitution in both the 5th and 14th Amendment is the concept of equal protection. And if you are charged with trespass, and I am charged with trespass, whether we're in Oregon or we're in Alabama, our sentences are going to be roughly the same for that trespass. If you destroy federal property, same thing. You commit murder, same thing. We have equal protection. We have equal justice under the law. We have the blind lady justice. And it doesn't matter if you are a J6er or you are a Black Lives Matter or you are Antifa. If you commit the same crime, you should be treated the same. So one of the problems that I see with January 6th and why it was so destructive and so toxic to our country is that we treated a certain segment of people very, very, very different than we treated another group of people. And I always said, and I even said this in the one debate that Liz Cheney and I had, she said that Donald Trump was the biggest threat to democracy of anything that had ever happened in our history. And I said, first of all, we are not a democracy, and perhaps that's the problem that you have with not understanding our form of government. But second of all, Donald Trump is not the biggest threat to our form of our democracy or our republic. It is unequal application of the law. You look at what happened in Portland, Oregon during the summer of 2020, where you had weeks on end of an attack against a federal building. Well, as a federal attorney or someone who did a lot of work in federal courthouses, I can tell you how frightening that is. They were using, bottle rockets. They were using the attack on the federal courthouse and in the police in Portland, Oregon was absolutely sustained. It was funded. It was not organic or grassroots. It was very well organized.
It was funded.
Absolutely.
Who was it?
So is Antifa.
So
George Soros, USAID.
USAID funded Antifa.
Funded BLM. That's right. And
how did USAID fund BLM?
Through the NGOs. Through the various NGOs. That's why tracing this money is so incredibly important. So then you go to January 6th, and there were some people who did stupid things, but there were also a lot of people who just got caught up in the moment. And one of the big things that's missing about January 6th and our understanding of what happened is that a lot of people, when they arrived at the Capitol, all of the bike racks and the security had already been removed. They didn't even know that they were walking into an alleged secure situation, yet they were also caught up in all of this. So my view of the January 6th last thing was pardoning all of them restored some semblance of equal justice under our laws, because none of the people in Portland who did what they did were prosecuted. All of the people who were involved in the Black Lives Matters, the billions of dollars of damage that was done during the summer of 2020, burning down Minneapolis, the activities in Washington, D.C. and in New York, nobody was held accountable for any of that. They should have been.
I might add 25 people were killed by the end of October in 2020.
And $2 billion in damage. Now, you're going to tell me that we're going to go after some grandmother who walked through the Capitol? You're going to go after somebody who maybe got shot with a rubber bullet or was gassed by the Capitol Police that day and reacted? We're going to put them in prison. The gentleman who got the longest sentence for January 6, 21, 22 years, wasn't even in Washington, D.C. the day on January 6th.
Is this the guy who was head of Proud Boys?
I think I don't know if it was Proud Boys or another organization. Okay. Ricky Torres, am I saying that?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure what his name was. But here's the thing. You want to know what they did? They convicted him on conspiracy. And you know what their argument was on conspiracy? Sometimes it doesn't have to be spoken. It can be a wink or a nod. They knew that the juries were rigged in Washington, D.C. All of them were anti-Donald Trump. All of them were anti-Republican. The prosecutors knew that they were that they had juries that they could get convictions on. They used a statute that had been an accounting statute that had been adopted after Enron to make sure that companies were not destroying records in order to enhance these sentences. That was thrown out by the United States Supreme Court. That was one of the big arguments I had with Merrick Garland once at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. But they were doing everything they could to railroad people, and it wasn't a matter of justice. It was a matter of retribution, and it was a message to the rest of us: if you don't mess with us. So for me, it's always been an equal protection and a fairness issue.
Just to go back on the small detail of USAID funding Antifa, do you recall exactly which NGO it was funded through? Okay, and has that been a recent revelation?
Yeah, it was within the last, I don't know if it was Antifa, but I know Black Lives Matter. And keep in mind, they're one and the same with a lot of what happened during 2020.
Well, there's crossover, certainly.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We've covered a lot on this show about what happened.
The other thing Portland, that USAID funded were these radically liberal prosecutors who will not prosecute, who will not prosecute certain crimes or certain people. So George Soros put in $14 million. USAID put in $17 million to get him elected.
Was that in collaboration together?
I don't know if it was
just separately?
All I can tell you is that's some of the information that has come out from Doge.
Is that still happening? Not from USAID, obviously, but from Soros.
Funding the prosecutors?
Yeah.
I believe so. I mean, that's why we got Alvin Bragg in New York City. It's why we ended up with the gentleman in both San Francisco and Los Angeles, Gascon, and what was the other one? Chesa Boudin. Both of them, one was recalled, the other one was not, but he did lose his reelection last year. The gentleman in, I believe it's Baltimore, Maryland, is another one of the prosecutors that has refused to actually prosecute crimes.
You paint a sort of bleak picture of America under Biden. Is this damage that you think can be undone, or is there stuff that's been done that is going to be permanent damage to the United States?
That's why I'm so optimistic, because I know it can be undone. It's being undone in real time right now. And that's why you say, how do we hold them accountable? Elections matter. You have to hire, you have to vote for good people. And it's being done right now. And I've always said sunshine is the best disinfectant. And simply exposing what we've been funding, what we've been doing, not only in America, but around the world, I think has been extremely eye-opening for the American citizen. And I was on C-SPAN last week, and there was a question about, oh my gosh, we're going to lose all this money from USAID. And all these kids are going to be starving. And it's like, that's not what we were spending the money on. If we were just spending the money to help starving kids, I'd be okay with that. It was all the other nonsense that we were funding that needs to be exposed. And I said at the time, this is an 80-20 issue. I think it's probably closer to 90-10. I don't think the vast majority of Americans believe that we should be spending money on trans comic books in Peru when we have inner city schools in Philadelphia that are failing our students.
It's a hard argument to make, I think, at this point. Have you been involved in the Lake and Riley Act? I saw a photograph
Only in
of
the
you.
sense of voting for it, yes.
Okay, this seems like it's a very significant thing. It was very emotional watching the footage
I
of
was there.
Lake and Riley's mother being with President Trump as it was brought into law. From an American perspective, though, what is the significance of this? Is it going to make real change, or is it just to honor Laken?
It's going to make real change. It is going to make real change, because one of the things that these prosecutors have done, and that's why the person who was responsible for her murder was allowed to go free, is that the prosecutors are not prosecuting really bad people because they know they're here illegally. And if they prosecute them, they're either going to have to work with ICE and deport them, or they're actually going to have to charge them and they're going to spend a lot of time in prison. So that is we have had a hearing. We had a hearing with the mothers of many of these young victims. So, Jocelyn Nagari's mother came and testified before the Judiciary Committee about 4 or 5 months ago. Rachel Moran, her mother came. Kayla's mother came, and they came and testified before the Judiciary Committee of what it's like to lose a daughter, rape, murder by illegal aliens, and what it has done to their lives, and why we need to change the law. And that's the Lake and Riley Act. And that is that if you are in the United States illegally and you commit a crime, we're going to nail you. We're not going to just let you go and brush it off and say, well, too bad on that. We're going to make you pay for the crime that you committed, and we're going to get you out of our country. We are not going to be allowing criminal illegals to stay in our country to prey on our women and children.
What do you make of Tom Homan and his? What can we expect to see from him and the new management of the borders? I
said earlier that one of the only jobs or responsibilities of a government is to protect its people, and that is from outsiders who would cause it damage. And Tom Homan is the person who is going to protect all of us. One of the things that is talked about every once in a while and then kind of shoved under the rug is that under Joe Biden, and keep in mind, the official numbers at the end of Joe Biden's administration was that there were over 12 million illegals that came into our country. That's the official. Million. That's the official number from the Biden administration. It's not accurate.
Well, J.D. Vance said there's 25 million total in
Could
America,
be.
but and it seems like at least 20 million if you look at the sources. I didn't find 25 million, but I found.
But 12 million came in 4 years, which is not immigration. That's mass migration. And that is a completely different thing. And it's what I was talking about with some folks earlier, because it's happening in England as well. What we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years, both in Europe as well as the United States and North America, is mass migration, not immigration. Why that's significant is because what that's allowed these various groups to do is come in and basically set up shop in another country, but bring their own culture and never have to assimilate. The Pakistani rape gangs in England are exactly what I'm talking about. England allowed so many and brought in so many claiming they were refugees and they had to stay there, but they have not assimilated into English culture. They have maintained their own culture from Pakistan, and as a result, people have suffered. When we were talking during the election about the Haitians that have moved into that small community in Ohio, 2,000 to 3,000 Haitians into a town of 30,000 people, we can assimilate 3, 4, 5 families. When you're bringing in 2,000 to 3,000 people with those numbers, what you've done is they've set up their own enclave. They have their own form of justice. They have their own culture, everything. They are not assimilating into the society. And as a result, the existing society is losing. We're losing our culture. That's what happened under Joe Biden, was a form of mass migration from all over the world. And we have these pockets and these enclaves of people who hate America, but they're willing to take everything that we are willing to give them.
Do you think that, so obviously we're talking about illegal immigration, right?
Yes, I am.
Do you think America has lost its love for legal migration? Because I note it has, even amongst conservatives, generally speaking, America has a great tradition of being probably the most liberal pro-migration country in the world. Certainly more than Canada, more than almost all nations in the West. Do you think this is...
It's hurt it.
It's hurt it.
It's hurt it. I have people calling me and saying, I need you to do something about the HB1 visas, or I need you to do something about this. And I have to be very honest with them and say, there is absolutely no appetite right now for immigration reform. Right now, it is about securing the border. And all effort, all money, all focus has to be on securing that border. And until the borders are secure, we are not going to be looking at immigration reform. And I think that's very sad, because I think there are ways that we could reform our immigration to make it easier for good people to come into our country who want to assimilate, who understand our values, who want to be productive members of society and raise their family and have a lot of the same cultural attributes that we do. Even from third world countries. I believe that very sincerely. But what has happened with the mass immigration or migration over the last 4 years, it has left such a bad taste in everyone's mouths that we're terribly concerned about anything other than border security. And I think that is a real tragedy of what they did. But when your goal is to collapse the system, you're going to collapse the system. When you collapse the system, you don't know how that dust is going to settle.
But you think that Biden was deliberately trying to collapse the system?
I do. I think that.
But come on, you really think that?
I do, but I don't think it was Biden, and I never did. Because I've said for years that Biden was suffering from severe cognitive decline.
Well, that was obvious.
So I don't believe that was Biden. Biden was the vessel. Biden was simply the vessel, and it's why his 4 years were so incredibly dangerous, not only for America, but for the United States, because nobody truly knew who was making the decisions behind the scenes for such things as mass migration. I had Mayorkas in front of me. I told him what a corrupt person I thought that he was, to his face. He's one of the most corrupt.
Who's Mayorkas?
Mayorkas was the head of Homeland Security, the bald guy. He was the one who did this. He's the one who threw open the doors. He's the one who was funding, censorship apparatuses at universities with the Department of Homeland Security. Do I think he was partially responsible? I do. I don't. But who was behind him and why? What is the purpose? Is really what you're getting to. Why would you want an invasion like this? Why would you want to allow millions of undocumented illegal aliens to come into your country? But we can ask Germany that. We can ask England that. We can ask France that. We can ask the countries that have also done it in the European Union. And I think it in part has to do with the fact that the birth rate is declining. So they're worried about workers being able to produce what they need to produce. I also think it is a form of wrong-headed altruism that is not that does not exist in reality. That
suicidal empathy, maybe.
It is. I don't think that they understand. I think that they think they're helping people when really all they're doing is engaging. I said all along, Joe Biden and Mayorkas are the two largest human traffickers in U.S. history, and they are. That's what they did. They were drug smugglers and human traffickers because they were the point of the spear that allowed this catastrophe to happen.
What's curious is that under Obama, Obama deported a lot of people. I think did he have the record for deporting most amount of illegal migrants?
Could be. I question statistics coming out of our government quite a bit, but yes, but he didn't do the mass migration. Even under him, he didn't do what Joe Biden did in 4 years. And that's why we're looking at Donald Trump with kind of a shock and awe approach to everything with these executive orders and DOGE and everything. I think Biden's was a shock and awe, too. The moment the people were ready, the NGOs were ready. They were ready to invade our country. This wasn't a matter of, hey, I got into the country really easy last week. Maybe you ought to start north and you'll get here in 6 months and it's going to be, they were ready to go. Those NGOs were funneling people north to be ready on that border to come in as quickly as they possibly could. And they were coming across in droves. I was down on the border outside of Yuma, Arizona, Eagle Pass, Texas, standing there as a member of Congress with 25 other members of Congress, watching them swim across the river. And the Border Patrol going and picking them up, hauling them in, giving them their meals, getting them all the clothes that they needed. We had an operation on the border that was absolutely mind-blowing in terms of its efficiency of processing illegal aliens. We didn't make the same effort at keeping them out of the country in the first place.
There's as you speak, I sort of think about my country as well, and Britain, where we're speaking now, and so we have so many similar problems, and not only immigration, but you talked earlier about two-tier justice, and well, that's what we call it. I don't think you have the same one. I think to sort of tie this all together in a message of hope, because I would say Britain sort of had a MAGA moment in 2019 with Boris Johnson, and we've completely squandered it.
You did.
And we're in a total mess. And actually, if you look at polling, I think most Britons don't like Trump or necessarily the MAGA movement. They don't understand these things. And I just wanted I wanted an outsider's opinion on what's going on in Britain, if you had any insight, even if it's just from your short time here.
Human nature is always going to flourish. That's what we're always looking at, protecting our family and our loved ones and our community and our state. We all have a strong sense of patriotism. We all have a strong sense of pride of where we come from. We all have a strong sense of love for our country. Sometimes we put people in leadership positions who are really, really bad. And that's where Europe is right now, and it's where we were for the last 4 years. But if we could change as rapidly as we did in the United States of America with 330 million people, our ship is a heck of a lot bigger than England's. But if we were able to do that, England can do it too. But people have to fight back. And where the crux is, and I truly believe this, the reason that the leadership in Europe is trying to squelch free speech, that they're trying to stop people from talking, is because that they know they messed up. The leadership in France and Germany and England and the European Union and all of these countries, they know that mass migration was wrong. They're not the ones suffering the consequences. It's the poor people in the communities that are.
Yeah.
They're not the ones suffering the consequences, but they know it was wrong. And instead of admitting that and being willing to turn directions or correct course, they're saying, now you shut up. You're not going to tell us how wrong it is, and you're not going to tell your neighbors, and you're not going to go down and pray in front of an abortion clinic. We are going to make it so that you cannot speak. But that is so antithetical to the human condition. All of us need to have a voice. Everyone aspires to have a voice, to be able to say, I am free. I am in control of my own destiny. And throughout history, it has always been a very small number of people who changed the course of history. We have to have brave people who are willing to stand up and say, you're not taking my voice. You cannot take my voice. I have the right to speak out at the failed policies that you have foisted upon us. And we have the right to defend ourselves against a rogue government. So I believe that the people of England, the people of France, the people of Germany, the people of Denmark, I believe that they want to live free. I believe that they want freedom. I believe that they want free trade. I believe that they want good things for their family, but they've put people in leadership positions that are really bad, and they need to get rid of them.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Congresswoman Harriet Hageman, thank you so much for your time. Where can listeners find you? How can they learn about what else you're getting up to? I suppose they just have to turn on the news, and you're all over YouTube, and that might be the easiest thing to do.
I think it is the easiest thing to do. And I have a newsletter that I send out every Sunday telling everybody what I'm doing. You can sign up for my newsletter. I think it's hageman.us.gov, something like that. I don't know what it is.
Well, a pleasure to speak to you, and safe travels back to the wonderful state of Wyoming. You are unbelievably lucky to live that place, and I hope you appreciate just how lucky you are now that you visited East London, that has never recovered from being bombed by the Germans.
Oh, it's
80 years on. Yeah, you're too kind. Congresswoman Hageman, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Winston Marshall Show. That was Congresswoman Harriet Hageman. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you want to support the show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Congresswoman Hageman exploring the issues you want to hear about and that the mainstream media won't touch. And remember, head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk where you can get exclusive videos, interviews, content, and ad-free viewing. But until next time, be well.